name is Latoya Obi. I have been with Tandem for about 3 years now. I have been in any leave related position from short term disability, ADA, for about 15 years now. So that has been my life.
I'll jump in next. I actually come from the leave space as well. My name's Robert Lopez. I joined Tandem last year. I think it's been about a year, almost and a half now. And I am the HR Shared Services Manager, kind of overseeing our leave team and a couple other teams as well.
Hi, and that leaves me. So I am Linda Smith, and I am an HR business partner here at Tandem. I've been with Tandem probably about a year and a half as well, but in HR in various roles throughout my about 20 years of being in HR, different industries. And so been here though about that year and a half.
Awesome. Thank you all for those introductions. So I think we'll begin by addressing just a very common question. And that is, what is a leave of absence? Just to orient ourselves in the audience, what is a leave of absence and what are the different types? So Linda, do you want to kick us off with that big, broad question?
Yeah. So yeah, the leave is a big question for sure. But generally, it just kind of encompasses an extended time of time away from work that's needed. That's a little bit more beyond what you would really regularly have under your sick or PTO or vacation policy. And it typically is specifically designed as an unpaid, but can be a job protected type of situation. But there are a lot of different questions and types that we're going to tackle today and just kind of give you a summary of. And from there, I think Latoya is going to kind of give us just a little bit more detail on that.
Of course. So as Linda said, there are a variation of leave types. The biggest one being obviously FMLA, which is the Family Medical Leave Act. That's the biggest one because it's federally mandated. You do have just your standard company leave of absences, which is depending on what's in your handbook for the companies. You have your military leaves. You have ADA accommodations. You have VESA, which is just the state of Illinois, but it's the Victims Economic Security and Safety Act, and your state leaves, which are very, very complex and very tedious. So yeah, there's a lot of different leave types, but the biggest one is FMLA.
I would imagine, Robert, that each of those different leave types have different implications for the employee.
And the employer as well. There's a lot happening here when it comes to leave. And as Linda said, it's like an extended amount of time off away from work. And so most of these leaves are actually the biggest pain point that we see is, it's unpaid. It's protected unpaid leave unless the company has some sort of policy to say, hey, we're going to give you PTO. We're going to allow you to, take this amount of time off and we're going to pay for it. You've got FMLA that can go up to 12 weeks and, clients may not be able to have a policy that extends that much pay. We're seeing now states are providing state paid leaves, which are great. A couple of them will be run through their own agency. We're starting to see that state paid leaves are also run through unemployment agencies. So that can also get a little bit tricky as to if you get an unemployment claim, but with an employee that is still active but on leave, it gets tricky. They're on top, workers' comp. That's compensation. They're on top. A couple of states also have their own sick paid time off. And if your company has also PTO, you also have to consider all of that. So taking into account what type of leave are you going to have to use and how are you going to balance that out with some sort of pay?
Yeah, I think that's what, just in my experience, I think that's what gets really confusing for people because generally speaking, if an employee isn't taking a leave of absence, it may be the first time that they've encountered it, depending on the size of the company. You know, the HR team or the whoever's administering leave at the company, they may not be familiar with it, but you have these distinct categories of things to keep in mind. What gives the employee the right to be away from work?
Right.
What gives the employee the right to come back to work?
Mhm.
What happens to the employee's benefits while they're out? What happens to the employee's pay while they're out? And so it tangles up with all these other types of issues like benefits and insurance policies and things like that. So
Mhm.
it can be very complex. But I think that the biggest one that people have heard of the most is FMLA, like you mentioned, Latoya, it's federally mandated. So I think that's probably a good place to start. You know, most people have heard of it, even if they don't know exactly what FMLA means. Latoya, can you kind of give us an orientation to what FMLA is, who it applies to, and what it requires?
Of course. So the acronym, as I said before, is Family Medical Leave Act. It's a required for private employers with 50 or more employees for at least 20 weeks within a radius of 75 miles from your office. Now, of course, that's a lot of numbers. However, that 50 employee does also include temp employees if they outsource out. So it just 50 is the magical number. But for clients that have acquired that, it does allow the employee who has been employed for a year, 12 months, and has worked for 1,250 hours. And it's not paid hours, it's actually worked hours. So we do have a separation of that where people, if you submit PTO, that's separated from your hours worked. So it has to be actual hours worked accumulated over 1 year for 1,250 hours. I argue with people every day about those hours, but there is a difference. You have your hours that you work and you have your hours that you're paid. They're not the same. However, with under FMLA, you are granted, as you said before, up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave during 1 year. So the client has the option to choose the calendar year that they want to adhere to. You have the rolling calendar year. You have just like your regular standard calendar year, and there's no right or wrong way. It's up to the company to decide what they want to do. The rolling calendar year would mean, let's say, if I take time off now in September, I won't regain my time back until next year, September, versus the standard calendar year, whereas every January 1st, my time starts over. So it's up to the client to decide how they want to administer that. Again, there's no right or wrong way. There's no, you have to do it this way. It is a choice. And so within within that 12 weeks, there are stipulations on what is considered eligible for that, for a serious health condition of yourself or a family member. Now, again, this is a tricky one because, of course, we all have different family members. We have siblings, we have grandparents, but unfortunately, they're not covered. It's only to care for a child, a spouse, or a parent. There is a nice little segue of in loco parentis. That's another segue in a whole conversation in itself. But that's someone that stands in place of a parent, but it's for a child under the age of 18. Of course, birth is kind of self-explanatory, or adoption. They work hand in hand. There is no difference in that time allotted. It's just the paperwork that's required. And for family members in the military, whether if it's active duty, care for them, things like that. But other than that, that's kind of the gist of FMLA. I know it's a lot to cover, but
Yeah.
that part has not changed. That's kind of just stuff.
Yeah.
So
And one theme that you see with FMLA, and you'll hear us repeat, is it depends. So after that whole state or federal story that Latoya just shared, then other states may have more expanded versions of FMLA. So there's 13 different states that have implemented additional leave portions of FMLA. and 13 have implemented their own, and then 11 have expanded versions of it. And so when it comes to FMLA, it's the number one answer is, well, it depends. Tell me about that employee situation.
And I kind of want to go off of that, because while a lot of these things depend, I have to put my compliance hat on and say it depends, but also be consistent in your practices and everything that you're doing. FMLA is a standard. We've got the requirements that you have to meet the requirements as an employer. You have to meet the requirements as an employee. It's minimum requirement for FMLA is that the employee is allowed 15 days to return medical certification before you can make any sort of decision. And so you can be a little bit more lenient, you can stick to that, but if you're being lenient, you have to be lenient with everyone else that comes in. I have a quick story. And it may not be my favorite story, but a couple of years ago, I was working at an organization that we had a couple different locations, managers, and leave was managed by different teams. Same policy though, same process. We had, and I'm just going to use A and B. We had employee A request for a leave. They were going to be out for an amount of time, and they got along with their managers really well. They couldn't return paperwork on time. They couldn't return to work on time, and there was flexibility there. And that's nice to see that helps retain the employee. On the flip side, though, we had employee B who, same thing, needed a leave, talked to their manager, and while also same thing, good relationship there. They stuck to the policy. They stuck to, this is how everything needed to get done. They needed to return paperwork in 15 days. They needed to go through the entire process. And while neither one of the managers did anything wrong, and it was good relationships across the board, it was a situation where employee B's medical bills came out to be too much. The only thing that they could do is put in some sort of litigation so that they could settle for an amount. It seemed like because employee A had that much more flexibility and employee wasn't a protected status, they used that. And so it kind of sucks sometimes, and that everyone did everything right, but because there was that inconsistency, it opened the door for non-compliance. It opened the door for, hey, I'm in this tough spot, I need money, and this is the only way I know how to get it. And it reached to the point like we needed to settle it. It's kind of unfortunate, but it speaks to we have something that we need to be compliant about. We have something that we need to be consistent about, even though sometimes it depends.
That here's the requirements and we can deviate from that, but if we deviate from that, we need to be consistent in how we deviate. Right. And if we're going to be more generous, we can't be less generous, but if we're going to be a little more generous to employees, then we need to be consistent in how we're being generous. Latoya, you mentioned 12, the 12 weeks, but it's unpaid. What then is this is probably a stupid question, but what is the benefit of FMLA if, hey, you can be out for 12 weeks, but you're not getting paid? I mean, most people can't go for 12 weeks without getting paid. So what's the benefit to the employee for even taking FMLA leave?
It protects their job. That's the biggest benefit there is. It protects their job, and it also protects their benefits while they're out within that 12 weeks of time. Yeah. For the most part, when we all take on jobs, and you all are given a handbook, how many of us actually read that handbook? Not many. I'm guilty. However, we can never plan for things to happen, but unfortunately they do. So it's always, in my opinion, a good idea to read your handbook to see what policies are in place. If this company is eligible for FMLA, do they have a company LOA? Do they have a short-term disability policy that I can join or pay into when benefits roll around? Some companies pay into the benefit, or they match it, kind of like 401k, and some have where you have to pay it on your own. You can also outsource for your own short-term disability through any type of insurance agency, to kind of be prepared for things. No, same with car insurance. You don't get in accidents every day, but you pay a car insurance every day. So when that does happen, you're covered. Short-term disability is the same way. Obviously, it's an additional bill that we pay, but it's worth putting effort into. But most people don't even know that they have that option or they have that available. Unfortunately, short-term disability only covers for your own serious health condition. However, so that's the little difference there. If you're out for a sick kid, spouse, you don't get paid for that. But that's just one of those things where you have to kind of decide, when you take on different jobs for different companies, what's the benefit for you? And so with FMLA, the only benefit that you have is that it covers your job for 12 weeks and it covers your benefits. Unfortunately, it is unpaid, but there's other resources to accommodate for that if and when that happens.
It's like it's a safety net, right? If something
Yep.
really bad happens, you can be away from work for a period of time and then have a legal right to come back to the job that you had and have a legal right to stay on benefits.
Yeah.
Like you said, there are other ways to account for the pay, but we've been talking a lot about the requirements, what employers are subject to it, what employees are eligible for it, but how does FMLA work like in practice, like day to day? What do you see, Latoya?
Practice wise, from my perspective, it's just a matter.
How does it start? Like how do we know, okay, we're in an FMLA situation? How do we know that? And then what do we do once we know that?
So best practice would be to notify your manager, someone of seniority, that you need to take a leave of absence. Whether if it's sometimes if you have a surgery coming up in 2 months, make mention of it to get the process started. Obviously, sometimes there's emergencies that come about where you're not in a position to notify them. However, if you're out for 3 or more consecutive days for a medical reason, whether it be for yourself or to care for someone else, by law, you're entitled to open up a claim. Now, the client can open that up on the employee's behalf, or the employee can open it up themselves. However, if the employee makes contact to say, hey, I need a leave of absence, the company has 5 business days to get them their paperwork, rights and responsibilities to proceed, and then follow the 15 calendar day protocol for having the paperwork returned. If there's a situation where the client opens the claim up for the employee, it is their responsibility to notify them, whether if it's directly. That's why we have emergency contacts on file to reach out just to say, hey, this claim has been opened on your behalf. These are the stipulations. So there's protection on all ends. Where the client is protected, they're doing their due diligence to administer and open that up for them, as well as the employee, because of course it protects their job. So everyone across the board has their own safety net, so to speak, but making sure that they're following proper protocol. So first steps is acknowledging like, hey, I need a leave. Or again, if you know that someone has been out medically for 3 or more consecutive days, that is the green light to say, let's start this conversation about FMLA, opening up a claim, getting them out their paperwork, and making sure that they understand next steps process, whether it be verbal. My recommendation, emails are something that we can kind of keep track of. Email threads, conversations aren't easily to kind of keep track of.
Yeah, it doesn't always come in as clean and clear as
No.
hey, I need FMLA. Sometimes it's just, you're sitting around a table, lunchroom, and and the employee's talking and a manager's present, and you hear an employee just say, oh, I'm going to have surgery later, or I'm going to have to, be out for some medical type condition on leave. That's enough of a notice for the employer then to be responsible to make sure that they reconnect with that employee and give them notice or a way to submit for it if they need to do so. So, sometimes it's a form that you give them that they kick off the process on. Sometimes it's, hey, go contact or email this person. But definitely, sometimes that notice isn't as
It-
clear as somebody coming and saying, I'm looking for FMLA, or I'm looking for a leave. And sometimes that can get lost, because oftentimes I'll hear from an employee or that says, oh yeah, 6 months ago, Susie told me she was going to need this. I'm like, okay, did we send her the information then? And, sometimes we don't remember to do that or know to do that.
So like specific to FMLA, you've got the verbiage under FMLA that says a representative of the organization. So it doesn't have to be a manager, it doesn't have to be HR, it doesn't have to be the CEO. It could be a team lead or a supervisor that they report into. It's whoever they say some of those words that's kind of speaks to they would need to take a leave, and they don't even have to say that. It's already a notification to the organization overall, that process has started. And from that point on, you only have 5 days to provide them with their rights and responsibilities, again, under FMLA, or to launch that process. But I mean, Linda, you make a good point in that you have to get them some sort of form out, because while FMLA and the Department of Labor provides medical certification, a form that can be used for all these sort of instances, as long as the organization, the employer, has a document that has all of that information, they don't have to use that medical certification from the Department of Labor. It just has to be something similar. And it's something that you have to consider, because now you have to differentiate what's a doctor's note and what's a medical certification. How's everything going to get protected? But definitely having those employees go to someone that knows how this process works, and providing them with that resource.
Couple of key things that I heard there. One is any representative of the organization. Rob, that's a good point. It doesn't have to be the manager, director, VP or HR. But if to Linda's example, if you're sitting around, if you are a manager, if you are in a leadership position, if you are able to speak to the organization in some capacity, and a colleague says, I'm gonna be out for surgery, like alarm bells should go off. Like, okay, we need to do something about that. Now I know. And so I guess my recommendation for that person would be, hey, you should probably go talk to HR. HR probably is more familiar with this, but we did get a question, notifying a manager versus HR. I've had employees share that they fear retaliation from managers, don't want their health information disclosed. And I think that's a good point, but I think that speaks to where you direct the employee versus where the employee just offers up information. If an employee does not feel comfortable talking to their manager, absolutely, they're not required to talk to their manager. They can go directly to HR and say, hey, I'm going to be having surgery. I'm going to be out for a while. How does this work? But if the manager doesn't know, then it's up to the manager to raise that to HR, or if they feel comfortable to engage with the employee in that discussion. So that's one, like, where does the duty arise? And I guess the takeaway for me, and what I want the participants to understand, is an employee does not have to say, I would like a FMLA, please. Like, that is not required. It's, hey, I'm going to be out for a while. And if the employer hears something like that triggers, hey, that might qualify for FMLA, it's up to the employer to then offer it, or at least follow up and see if FMLA would apply.
And to your point, I mean, Latoya even said it earlier that FMLA is job protection. It's you are protecting their position, and when they come back from their leave, they're supposed to be coming right back into their same position, if not a like position. If their position had been eliminated while they were gone, then you need to bring them back to a like position. So it's definitely bring them back. Now, from an HR perspective, is that if you are working with this employee, walking them through the process, you don't have to give the manager all the information. You could just let them know, hey, this employee is going on a leave. They're protected under FMLA. They're going to be gone from this day to this day. And when they come back, they need to go back to their prior position. And then definitely allow that employee to check in with you if they fear retaliation. Have that conversation with them. Why is that so? And let's make sure that your job continues to be protected.
I don't think most people know what HIPAA is.
Good
Go
point.
for it.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of people don't understand that they're protected under HIPAA. And I think, there's a lot of fear in the workplace when it comes to, like the question said, fear of retaliation, of knowing that I have a medical condition that can possibly jeopardize my job. But for the sake of, again, not wanting to relinquish that information, you don't say anything. And so it kind of, you either worsen yourself medically or you take a chance and you try to hide it. But for that reason, if the company is eligible and you're eligible for FMLA, you are protected. And I think that's the biggest thing that most employees or employers don't understand when it comes to that word retaliation. That's illegal. So in that aspect, if you again just say, hey, I need to take some time off, you're not required to tell them, oh, I have leukemia, oh, I have cancer. You are not required to tell them any of your medical information. And if for any reason that is out or shared not at your liberty, that's against HIPAA violation, whether you outsource out or, whether you're insourcing or, at that point, like you said, you direct them to the HR. You don't have to talk to your manager. The only thing the manager would need to know is, hey, this employee will be out for this amount of time. They'll be back on this date, and that's it. Nothing else, no further conversation is needed or necessary about your specific medical necessities unless we're involving ADA or there's some restrictions of your coming back at that point. That's the only time that medical is shared. And that's just based on the stipulations of your job description versus your restrictions of coming back to work.
So once we know an employee is going to be out as an employer, Latoya, you mentioned sending paperwork within 5 days, and is that the notice of rights and responsibilities, or what is that called?
So for us, it's a packet. So you get a cover letter that just kind of outlines what you'll be getting in a packet. You do have your notice of rights and responsibilities of your protection under FMLA. And then you're also given medical certification forms. It has to be completed by the doctor. But like Robert said, that's a formality. You don't necessarily have to use those forms. Your doctor can very much well provide medical notes, office visit notes, doctor's notes on letterheads, as long as it follows the stipulations of one, confirming a serious health condition and providing a date range that you'll need to be out. If it's for a continuous leave, it's certifiable. If it's for an intermittent leave, start date, end date, frequency. So although the forms are a formality, it's not a requirement. It's just, here's something that you can use for this, but you can, as long as you provide some type of medical certification,
Yeah,
and it covers the basics, it's fine.
and I think that's important too. That we don't want the employee to feel like they need to disclose everything about their medical condition, but on the other hand, the employer just doesn't have to take their word for it. That
Right.
Hey, I'm going to be out. The employer does have the ability to verify that through a medical certification, right?
Yep.
And that will oftentimes, most times, determine the length of the FMLA leave that's needed.
Yep, it has to be the determination is based on the medical certification. So let's say if your doctor says, oh, Susan can only be out for 2 weeks, and you say, oh, well, I need 4 weeks. If it's not certified by the doctor, it's not covered. So at that point, you would have to go back to your doctor to see if they'll update the certification. But we can only approve what the doctor certifies. If it differs from what you are asking for, you can't just say, oh, well, I want more time under FMLA off of because you want it. It has to be certified by a doctor. If it's not certified, it's not covered.
Got it. And we have a question here, but before we get to the question, I want to set it up a little bit because you mentioned a little bit ago, Latoya, intermittent FMLA leave. Can you explain what that is and distinguish it from, I don't know, regular FMLA leave?
Of course. So a continuous leave is just on a continuous basis. So it's like 2 weeks out consecutive, no breaks, no nothing. You're out for 2 weeks. Intermittent leave, the best way to explain that is, let's say I'll use it as cancer as an example. You have chemo. You may have chemo 3 times a week, up to 4 hours per appointment. And so the doctor would need to certify exactly what that looks like, from how long it takes, how often it takes, and you are accounted for in the hours increments that you utilize. So again, let's say chemo was 3 hours long, but you have a 2-hour commute. That gives you 5 hours to be out, and you can still work 3 hours if you have a 8-hour schedule. And so at that point, you would report to your employer as a call out, like, hey, I need to use FMLA today for 4 hours. I have an appointment. And you have to acknowledge. Now, at that point, you do have to mention FMLA. You do have to mention the utilization. If you have an intermittent leave approved, you have to call in and report it, because your employer has to track that. And so it just kind of depends on, again, what the doctor certifies, how often, but you still are only allotted 12 weeks. But 12 weeks is calculated based on, let's say, if you work 40 hours a week, you have 480 hours to use in a year.
Yeah, and I really like what you said there about the employee needs to inform their supervisor, the employer. It is an open dialogue between the employee and the employer, especially for the intermittent part, I should say. That it's just not one-sided. They do need to be responsible in their attendance and follow your attendance policy and make sure you do notification. So that's a really great point to bring up, because sometimes people forget that part.
And they can be penalized and reprimanded if they don't adhere to the certain schedule. So let's say if the doctor certifies you 3 days for 4 hours and you do 5 days for 6 hours. Yeah. It is the employer has a right to reach out to say, hey, this is out of compliance. We need updated medical to match the days. If it's not received, then they are subjected to their company's attendance policy and can be reprimanded for whatever that looks like, to the point of, yes, your job is protected under FMLA, but you have to adhere to what's being certified. You don't get to pick and choose or go outside of the parameters of what you're certified for. And that's where the confusion comes from. It's like, oh, I'm protected under FMLA. Yeah, but that's not what the doctor certified. He said 3 days, you've used 4. It's really just that simple. And that one day falls out of compliance, it has to be accounted for. And if the employer requests updated medical and it's not received, then that one day is not protected.
Yeah, I will say so, and I think Linda and Latoya, you both had 2 keywords in there that I want to hone in on, because I think they're so important and they may be missed. But Linda said the word forget, and it's exactly that. Either the employee may forget to report it in, but it's knowing the forgetting portion is that they knew what their responsibility was to begin with. And so from protecting yourself from a compliance standpoint, you want to make sure that any documentation that you let them know when you're approving intermittent time off is that, hey, you still have a responsibility to report it in this fashion, in this way. You have to say this, and this. If they don't abide by that, then you go to the side of, well, now we still have to follow our policies. We still have to follow the attendance policy. But you still have to make the effort on the front end to say, this is what the expectation is. That you're approved for intermittent, but you're expected to report it in this fashion. If it's a flare-up, and you can't get to the phone, you can't report it in, then you have 24 hours to report it. Whatever the policies are set up, that you work with your legal counsel to make sure that they're abiding by all the regulations, but also making sure that the employee knows what those are. Now that goes to Latoya's point and my second keyword, which was rights, and it's that the employer also has the rights, so that if the employee falls outside the boundaries of FMLA usage, you have the right to ask for additional certification. You have the right to ask, hey, what's going on? Do we need to update your intermittent time off? I think from my end, if there's an employee that takes one more day off in a 4 or 5 month span, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if it continues to become a habit, then hey, again, you have a right to ask for that updated medical certification.
Yeah, and I think we did a great job of answering the question. Hopefully the asker agrees. Because that's kind of exactly what they had going on. Someone who is not reporting to their manager that, hey, this is when I'm going to be out, or this is when my treatment is, or whatever the case may be. And then consequently, the managers can't keep track of, well, is that FMLA? Is it not FMLA?
Right.
So, like Latoya, you said, you have a right, but it doesn't exceed what's medically necessary or what's on the certification. So you can't, just because you are on an intermittent FMLA leave of absence does not mean you can call in on Monday morning because you have brown bottle fever or something like that. Like, it has to be for that purpose. And to me, it goes back to expectation setting, right? Like, this is the federal law that we're trying to comply with. We're doing our best, employee, to comply with that and to accommodate what's going on with you, because it's very important what you're doing. You don't take FMLA leave for trivial things. However, this has to work both ways. For us to fulfill our responsibilities, we need you to live up to your responsibilities. And so if you can't do that, then we're going to warn you. We're going to formally warn you, and then escalate from there. I think there's a tendency to, when someone's on a leave, they are untouchable for a certain period of time. And I certainly understand that, because there are, it's not something that happens all the time. So you're probably less familiar with it as an employer. And there are rights and protections that are offered to people on leaves of absence for good reason. But that doesn't mean that they get carte blanche to do whatever they want. What I would say in that situation is, maybe work with, if you have outside counsel, or work with, your HR professionals, and try and do some expectation setting with the person. They may not give you the response that you want, but we're trying to help you, help us help you. Is probably how I would try and approach that, if at all possible.
And it's across the board too, because it's the expectation setting from the beginning. And so I want to make sure, we've talked about continuous, we've talked about intermittent. There's a third type as well, and that it's just a reduction in hours. And as an employer, you could have a regular workday of 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, and have nothing outside of those hours. And so the employee can only work 6 hours a day. You could essentially just say that FMLA is allowing you for a reduction in hours. You're only working 6 hours a day, and the rest of 2 hours are going to be covered by FMLA. Intermittent, we see it a lot more when there's flare-ups, when there is appointments, when there's something outside the ordinary to cover for those hours. So it just kind of depends on how the employer is set up. But Marcus, to your point, it's setting that expectation from the beginning. We've got the medical certification. Let's have a conversation. Do you need to take continuous time off? Do you need to take intermittent? What are those parameters? Do you need a reduction in hours? How long? How many days?
Now, the issue with the reduced schedule that I run into is that's not mandatory. The client doesn't have to accept that. And that's where the employee will come and say, oh, well, my doctor said I can only work 4 hours. Well, depending on your job description, that the client may not be able to accommodate that, and they don't have to. And so at that point, it transitions to a continuous leave, and they're like, oh, well, I can't do this because I can't afford it. Then there's a different parameter of FMLA does not force the hand of the client to say you have to do this under a reduced schedule. For FMLA, it's not mandatory. They can't argue with intermittent and continuous, but they can push back on a reduced schedule. It's kind of the same as accommodations, so to speak.
Yeah.
They don't have to accept it, but if they don't accept it, then the employee has the choice to say whether or not you're going to take it on a continuous basis, or you're going to go back to work and work your full time. And so to be like, well, it's not fair. It isn't, but at the end of the day, it's based on the productivity of the client with the reduced schedule. It's not saying you can't, it's just saying it's at a lesser time. But a lot of people confuse reduced schedules and intermittent leave, and it's not the same.
But in all of those type of things, just make sure you have the real business reason as to why you're denying that for the employee. What is the hardship that is being produced from the employer's standpoint? Because that's the question. Like if we get asked in a case, if somebody files a claim against the organization, they're going to ask, why was that so hard for you? Why couldn't you do that for the employee?
I like to tell, employers like, hey, imagine you have to explain your decision to 12 people who don't know anything about you or about this employee. And would you get most or all of them to agree with your position? Because that it may come down to that at some point. So I want to be conscious of time. We have 15 minutes left. And I think we're going to have to go back and rename this presentation FMLA and then do it on leaves of absence. But I want to take one more question and then open it up to see if our participants have any questions. But the last question is, we've talked about when the need for leave comes up. We've talked about the medical certification, what types of leave, and setting the expectations, and how the employee gets paid through all that. So after they exhaust their 12 weeks, LaToya, it's okay to fire them, right?
No.
Yeah.
No, it is not.
What happens after they exhaust 12 weeks?
And the funny thing is, I get that question all the time. Like, it's like clockwork. But so at the time of exhaustion, best practice would be to have a conversation to see, if and when the doctor can provide a potential return to work date, to see if it's within means of, it may just be a couple days, it may be a week. But at that point, we do recommend that you explore the company policy if there is one. Hence, when I said the handbook, some clients don't have company policies. And so at that point, it's like, okay, well, once this exhausts, then they lose their job protection, which is true. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you fire them. It's more so, okay, if they can't come back in the capacity for this job, have you offered them another position? Is there something different if there's an alternative? So at that point, a conversation definitely does need to be had to see futuristically, are you able to return? Sometimes, again, they can. Sometimes it may be a matter of, I just haven't been able to get in to see my doctor because you have to have a release to get back to work, which is the fitness for duty form. And so at that point, the doctor signs off to say, hey, Susan is cleared, full capacity, no restrictions, they're good to go, they can return. Or, hey, Susie can't lift 10 pounds for about another 2 weeks, but after that, they're good to go. So again, conversations are needed to be had to see what the next steps are. And, if ADA comes into play, if a company LOA comes into play. So there's always an alternative. But like Linda said previously, you want to at least say, what did I do to help them come back? What efforts did we make? You have to have something, an effort. But even at that point, it's okay to have something written in stone in handbooks that says, if and when your FMLA exhausts, these are the next steps. This is, the practice of reaching out, seeing, of course, the job protection is gone. So that's not negotiable. But it's up to the client to say, we can still hold your job if you can reassure us that you can come back in 2 weeks, full capacity, no issues. So
Yeah, and I love what you were
it goes
saying
to the
there.
back. It depends.
Yeah, it depends. There it is
It
again.
depends.
And it really does depend because the end of FMLA, honestly, FMLA is just one part of an accommodation. There could be a myriad of other accommodations that could help satisfy and lead the employee back to full work hours. But if you don't have that conversation at the end of the FMLA, you may miss the opportunity to keep a really good employee in place. And they would miss the opportunity under the law of what their rights have to do. So there's under it, the different federal rules kind of start to mesh here because FMLA, and then how does that integrate with ADA or Americans with Disability Act? And that's the point where you want to engage in that open conversation about what is needed. How, can I give them an alternate work schedule? Can I give them a remote type scenario? Are reduced hours something that we can accommodate for them? Do they need an extra chair? So because they're recovering from their leg being or do they need extra breaks? Those are all kinds of things that you can engage in and understand after FMLA is even concluded to extend that time.
Yeah, I think again, for me, it's about being reasonable.
Yeah.
Right. And instead of yes, it is cleaner. It is easier to say, here is the rule. It always applies. But I mean, if you've ever spent any time in HR, dealt with any HR issues, you understand that people are complex. People are people, and understanding those nuances, understanding the particulars of the situation and how it fits with you as a company. And then, being able to say to anyone who's ever interested in it, like the EEOC, the DOL, a judge, an opposing counsel, we did what was reasonable, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of hard to say with any clarity that this is always what's reasonable, but you always want to do and try and strive for that. What's a reasonable end to this situation? So
the compassionate response to this.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, what's the compassionate response to this?
Right.
You can't take the human out of human resources now.
Well, we have let's see, I have 1:51 on my clock, and so we have about 9 minutes, so we'll open it up. If anyone is listening and they have questions, please drop those in the chat. We'd love to take any other questions that you have while we're waiting for questions to come in. Thank you, Linda, Robert, Latoya, for the conversation today. This really is a big topic, and we focus mostly on FMLA, but I think for good reason. That's the most common form of leave of absence. Maybe not the most common. It's certainly probably one of the most complex. There are a lot of rules to it, so I'm glad we got to talk about those in some detail. You can see my contact information is on the screen. If you don't want to ask a question here, feel free to send me an email. As we said earlier, you're going to get a recording of today's session if you signed up, if you registered. So look for that to hit your email as well. Let's see, I'm not seeing any questions. So I guess last call for questions, and we'll go ahead and wrap up. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Linda, Robert, Latoya, for the conversation, and we will do another Ask the HR Expert webinar next month, and probably sometime in the future we'll do another one on leaves of absence because there's a lot of uncovered ground here.
All right, thanks, Marcus.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.